In 1938, Nazi Germany launched one of the strangest military operations in history. They sent a ship called the MS Schwabenland to the most remote place on Earth, and when the crew came back, most of what they found was classified so deep that some of it still has not been fully released to the public. This is not a conspiracy theory. The expedition happened. The documents exist. The men were real, and the silence afterward was deliberate. The Schwabenland left Hamburg on December 17, 1938. It carried a crew of dozens of trained scientists, pilots, and military personnel under the command of Captain Alfred Richer. Richer was not some amateur. He was a decorated naval officer who had already led a famous Arctic expedition in 1912. They picked him because they needed someone who could operate in absolute cold with absolute discipline. The Third Reich did not send hobbyists to Antarctica. The mission had a public cover story. Germany wanted to claim Antarctic territory for the whaling industry. The country was running low on fats, which were critical for food and for making explosives, and whale oil was the answer. That part was real. But that explanation never fully covered what they actually did down there, how long they stayed, or why the documentation was handled the way it was after they returned. If you want to understand what really happened, subscribe and hit the bell. What you're about to hear is pulled from declassified files, post-war testimony, and records that governments spent decades pretending did not exist. The ship arrived in Antarctica on January 19, 1939. They entered a region called Queen Maud Land, which at that time was claimed by Norway. Within days, the Schwabenland launched its two Dornier seaplanes, the Boreas and the Passat. Over the next 3 weeks, those planes flew 14 mapping sorties across roughly 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory. That number is not an estimate. It comes from Richer's own mission report, which was filed on completion and then quietly shelved. Every 100 kilometers, the pilots dropped aluminum darts stamped with swastikas. They called this territory Neuschwabenland. It was a formal land claim, executed in full military style, over land that Norway had already named and mapped. Germany did not care. They were staking territory with iron and altitude. But the mapping flights revealed something unexpected. The aerial photographs captured what appeared to be open lakes, dark rock outcroppings, and in certain areas, what looked like warmer geological zones. In the 1930s, scientists already knew Antarctica had geothermal activity. Certain ice-free areas had been observed since early exploration. What Richer's team photographed was not magic or myth. It was geology. But the regime that received those photos was not thinking about geology. They were thinking about what you could build inside a continent nobody could reach. Richer filed his final expedition report in 1939. It was 380 pages long. Germany published a limited scientific version of the findings. The rest went into the SS archive system, which was administered at the time through Heinrich Himmler's personal research organization, the Ahnenerbe. That name matters. The Ahnenerbe was not a normal military office. It was Himmler's personal institution for racial pseudoscience, archaeological operations, and classified research. The fact that Antarctic expedition materials flowed through that office tells you the regime did not think of this as a whaling survey. The Ahnenerbe had been active since 1935. By 1939, it had formal university status, its own research staff, and a direct funding line from the SS. Himmler used it to pursue projects that were too ideologically sensitive for normal military channels. When those channels touched Antarctica, something shifted in how the expedition was classified. Then the war started. September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Antarctica became the least of anyone's public concerns. But privately, the planning did not stop. Between 1940 and 1945, a number of German submarines operating in the South Atlantic made documented stops near the Antarctic region. U-boat logs from that period, many of which were captured by Allied forces in 1945, show routes that pushed further south than any military necessity required. Historians have noted this. It is in the literature. The routes are anomalous. No one has given a fully satisfying explanation. By 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler died on April 30th. The Reich surrendered on May 8th. In the months that followed, Allied forces scrambled to capture German scientists, weapons, and documentation. Operation Paperclip alone brought over 1,600 German scientists to the United States. Most of what was captured came from facilities inside Germany itself, but not everything was found in Germany. Argentina had been a refuge for German nationals throughout the war. Buenos Aires in particular had a massive German expatriate community, and the Argentine government under Juan Perón was openly sympathetic to Germany even after the Allied victory. Between 1945 and 1955, an estimated 9,000 Nazi war criminals and SS officers entered Argentina using fraudulent documents and routes organized through what historians now call the rat lines. These were escape networks, some of them run partially through Vatican channels, that move fugitives out of Europe. The connection to Antarctica becomes direct when you look at who is going where. In 1947, the United States launched one of the largest military operations in Antarctic history, Operation High Jump. It was commanded by Admiral Richard Byrd, who was already the most famous Antarctic explorer in American history. The operation involved 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft. Official reason? Scientific research and training for cold weather operations. The problem is that you do not send a naval task force of that size for ice core samples. Byrd arrived at the Ross Ice Shelf on January 15, 1947. The operation was supposed to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted less than 2 months. Byrd pulled out in early March of that same year, cutting the mission dramatically short. No full public explanation was given. Byrd himself, in a Chilean newspaper interview given on March 5, 1947, made a statement that has been cited by researchers ever since. He warned of a potential enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He used the phrase incredible speeds. That statement was made by one of the most decorated and experienced polar commanders the United States had ever produced. It was not the raving of an eccentric. It was the public output of a classified debriefing, and it was the last time Byrd spoke openly about what happened during high jump. The Chilean newspaper was El Mercurio. The interview was conducted by journalist Lee Van Ada. The quotes are real, and they are documented. Byrd never contradicted them publicly, and the U.S. military never officially addressed them. Operation High Jump was followed by Operation Windmill in 1947 and 48, a smaller follow-up that completed some of the photographic and mapping work High Jump had abandoned. Then, in 1955, came Operation Deep Freeze, which established the permanent American presence at McMurdo Station. That base has been continuously occupied ever since. The U.S. government began building permanent infrastructure in Antarctica almost immediately after the massive armed operation that no one can fully explain. In 1958 and 1962, the United States detonated nuclear devices in the upper atmosphere near Antarctica as part of Operation Argus and the Fishbowl series. These were real nuclear tests conducted in one of the most remote regions on the planet, partly to study the electromagnetic pulse effects on the Van Allen belts. What they also did was make a very loud statement. Whatever was in that part of the world, the United States was not afraid to use nuclear weapons in proximity to it. The Antarctic Treaty was signed on December 1st, 1959. 12 nations signed it. The treaty banned military activity, nuclear testing, and territorial claims on the continent. It also established that no new claims could be made and that existing claims were effectively frozen. Germany, which no longer existed as a unified nation in 1959, had its Neuschwabenland claim nullified by default. But here is the part most people skip. The treaty also restricted civilian access in ways that went beyond what you would normally need for scientific preservation. Certain zones were designated off-limits, not because of environmental sensitivity, but because of undefined security concerns. Those restrictions have remained in place for over 60 years. The man who led the original 1939 German expedition, Captain Alfred Richer, survived the war. He died on March 30th, 1963, in Hamburg. He gave very few public statements about the Antarctic mission after 1945. What he did confirm in private correspondence that has since been partially published is that the expedition found significantly more than the official report described, and that he was told explicitly not to elaborate. He used the word explicitly. A career naval officer, a man who had operated in the Arctic in 1912 and the Antarctic in 1939, spent the rest of his life saying less than he knew. The question of what the Germans actually built in Antarctica, if they built anything at all, sits at the center of one of the most contested bodies of historical speculation in the modern era. The honest answer is that no confirmed physical structure from the Nazi period has been independently verified by researchers operating outside government channels. But the honest answer also includes the fact that Antarctica is the size of the United States and Mexico combined, that less than 1% of its landmass has been thoroughly surveyed at ground level, and that the geothermal regions photographed by Richter's planes in 1939 do in fact exist, and do in fact include areas where ice does not form and temperatures remain relatively stable. In 2012, a joint Russian and American team drilling at Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake roughly the size of Lake Ontario, buried under 4 kilometers of ice, broke through and found liquid water that had been sealed from the surface for approximately 15 million years. The biological samples they retrieved contained over 3,500 unique gene sequences, many of which did not match any known surface organism. Antarctica contains hidden worlds. That is not speculation. That is peer-reviewed science published in the journal Nature. In 2018, satellite imaging conducted by a team at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory revealed a previously unmapped geothermal region beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, covering an area of approximately 1 million square kilometers. The heat output of that region is comparable to Yellowstone. It had been sitting there, unknown to the public, for as long as records exist. Antarctica is not a blank white slate. It is a continent that actively hides what is beneath it. The SS officer Ernst Schaefer led the Ahnenerbe's Tibet expedition in 1938. the same year Richer was preparing for Antarctica. Schaefer collected biological specimens, made anthropological measurements, and brought back artifacts that went directly into Himmler's personal archive system. After the war, Schaefer was briefly detained, then released, and went on to have a quiet academic career in Venezuela. He never faced trial. His Antarctic counterpart, Richer, was never even detained. Both men carried information they never disclosed publicly. Both were allowed to simply continue living. In 1946, a former SS officer named Wilhelm Bernhard testified during preliminary Nuremberg proceedings that submarine cargo runs to Antarctic coordinates had been conducted at least twice in the final 18 months of the war. That testimony was entered into the record. It was not used in any final prosecution. It sits in the Nuremberg archive to this day, referenced by historians, never formally challenged, never formally confirmed. What makes this story different from ordinary war history is the convergence. You have the original German expedition with classified findings. You have the anomalous submarine routes. You have the escape of thousands of SS personnel through rat lines that passed through South America, which sits directly above the Antarctic. You have the largest single military operation in Antarctic history launched by the United States, just 2 years after the war ended, and pulled out early with no explanation. You have a nuclear test program conducted near the same continent. You have an international treaty that locked down access for the next 6 decades. And you have the men who knew, every single one of them, saying less than they could have. In 2016, the Russian government partially declassified a set of naval intelligence documents from the 1947 period related to their own observation of Operation High Jump. The documents describe American fleet movements consistent with the official record, but include several pages that are still redacted in the publicly available version. Russia observed the American operation closely. What they saw that required continued redaction in 2016 is not known. New Swabia, the region the Germans claimed in 1939, is now called Queen Maud Land again. It contains multiple mountain ranges, including the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, which are among the most isolated geological features on the planet. Flights over those mountains in recent decades have confirmed the presence of multiple ice-free valleys and exposed rock formations. The area first photographed by Richer's Dornier planes still has not been fully explored at ground level. 86 years after those flights, the territory those images revealed remains among the least visited places on Earth. Chile and Argentina have both maintained Antarctic territorial claims since the 1940s. Both countries also received the largest concentrations of Nazi émigrés after the war. That geographic overlap between the escape routes and the territorial claims is not something most historians have treated as coincidence. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, who was responsible for the torture and death of 4,000 people, was hidden in Bolivia with the help of American intelligence until 1983. If governments were willing to protect Barbie for nearly 4 decades, the scope of what else was protected in that era should not be underestimated. The Antarctic Treaty came up for review in 1991. It was renewed. It came up again in 2011 and was extended indefinitely. Every time, the provisions restricting military and independent civilian access were maintained without significant modification. The continent remains, by international law, one of the most legally restricted land masses on the planet. Scientists go, approved researchers go. Everyone else needs permission from a government that has already signed the treaty and agreed to its terms. What was on those 380 pages that Alfred Richer filed in 1939 and never saw released in full? What exactly did Richard Byrd's task force of 4,700 men encounter that cut the mission from 8 months to 8 weeks? What was in the cargo that SS submarines reportedly delivered to coordinates below 60 degrees south latitude in 1944? These are not questions invented by the internet. They are questions that exist in the documentary record and that have never been formally answered by any government that had access to the relevant material. The cold is useful. The isolation is useful. The darkness for 6 months of every year is useful. Whatever anyone did or built or hid at the bottom of the world, Antarctica offers one thing no other place on Earth can offer in the same concentration: absolute natural secrecy. The ice does not talk. The mountains do not file reports. The geothermal lakes under 4 kilometers of frozen water have been sealed for 15 million years. And they were still holding organisms that had never encountered the surface world when Russian drills finally broke through in 2012. Captain Alfred Richer mapped 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctica in 3 weeks in 1939 using technology that would look primitive today. What he found in those photographs was significant enough that Heinrich Himmler's Personal Research Bureau took custody of the results. What happened after that is classified, missing, or simply never spoken of by the men who knew. The last entry in the Schwabenland's official expedition log is dated February 6, 1939. 3 days later, the ship began its return to Germany. The crew arrived in Hamburg on April 11th. They were debriefed. They were told what they could say. Most of them said very little for the rest of their lives. The ice has kept the secret longer than any of them did.